Picture this, I'm shaking hands with Colorado State Attorney General Daniel Ruiz in my Mountain Lake cabin, going over hard proof that our HOA president has been skimming tens of thousands from elderly neighbors when my front door flies open like it's been hit with a battering ram. No knock, no permission. In stomps Janice Bickford, clutching her clipboard like it's a medieval weapon, barking about immediate code violations before she even looks up. She's spent half a year trying to bury me under fake fines and liens to steal my late father's land, and now she's just committed felony trespass in front of the state's top prosecutor. Janice freezes mid-rant. The Attorney General doesn't even blink, ma'am. You just broke multiple laws in front of the chief law enforcement officer in Colorado. Her face drains. Justice is about to be served ice cold. My name's Colin Mercer, and 3 years ago, life handed me something worth more than every dime in my bank account, my late father's lakeside cabin in Pine Ridge, Colorado. 45 minutes from the nearest grocery store, tucked between ponderosa pines and a deep, cold water lake so clear you could see trout flashing under the dock. It wasn't just real estate. It was the only place that had ever truly felt like home. Dad built the place in 1964 with his own 2 hands. Using cedar beams, he milled himself. Field stones he hauled from the lake shore, and whatever tools he could afford after coming back from Vietnam. The fireplace could heat half the valley. The walls were lined with knotty pine that still smelled faintly of sawdust and his Old Spice aftershave, even decades later. When you touched the wood, you could still feel the grooves left by his calloused hands, almost like he'd pressed his presence into every beam and board. Mornings here had a rhythm you couldn't buy. Steam curling from my dented aluminum coffee percolator, the slow, steady burble blending with the distant calls of loons across the lake. The old floorboards creaked under my bare feet, each groan a reminder of the hundreds of family barbecues, fishing trips, and Christmas mornings this place had seen. You sit on that dock as the mist rises off the water and you start thinking you could stay forever. And I would have if it weren't for Janice Bickford. I'm not sure what it takes to become the human embodiment of a paper cut that got infected, but Janice has it down to an art form. She rolled into Pine Ridge 5 years ago from somewhere downstate, which is how locals politely say nobody asked you to come here. Within 18 months, she'd muscled her way into the HOA presidency. She's in her late 50s, with tightly permed hair the color of weak coffee, a permanent squint that makes her look like she's judging your life choices, and a wardrobe full of aggressively pressed blazers, orthopedic shoes for comfort, though I suspect she likes the sound they make when stomping up to someone's porch. She drives a spotless white SUV with HOA decals plastered on the doors and parks it diagonally in front of whichever house she's about to terrorize, like she's staging a crime scene. Rumor has it she practices her intimidation face in the rearview mirror. Honestly, I believe it. I've seen the way she tilts her chin down, peers over the tops of her glasses, and then pauses for maximum discomfort before speaking. Her reign of terror has been creative. She made a Vietnam vet lower his flagpole by exactly 7 inches because it disrupted the visual harmony of the neighborhood. She ordered an elderly widow to dismantle her wind chimes, claiming they were noise pollution. She fined a young family $200 because their kids drew hopscotch squares in sidewalk chalk. Once, she actually stood over an 84-year-old man while he repainted his shed because she said his first coat wasn't the approved shade of brown. And then, inevitably, she turned her sights on me. It started on a Tuesday morning in March. Gray skies, a sharp wind rolling off the lake, the kind of morning that makes you appreciate hot coffee all the more. I was halfway through my second cup when I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel drive. That sound doesn't happen often here, and when it does, it's never good news. I opened the door to find Janice standing there, posture perfect, smile tighter than a drumskin, holding a stack of papers clipped together like they were the keys to the kingdom. "Courtesy notice," she announced, handing it over with the tone of someone gifting you a fruitcake you didn't want. I flipped through the pages. 47 violations. 47. My dock extended 3 feet past allowable limits. My storage shed improperly positioned relative to setback requirements. My fire pit, the one my father built out of stones from the property, labeled an unpermitted recreational combustion structure. Even the position of my mailbox was somehow non-compliant. She didn't blink. $750 in compliance review fees, she said, plus $75 per day until these are corrected. I pointed out that my cabin existed decades before her HOA was even formed. That's when she gave me the kind of smile that could curdle fresh milk. Previous ownership is legally irrelevant. Mr. Mercer, all properties under HOA jurisdiction must comply with current regulations. 30 days, or we file a lien. A lien? On the land my father built with calloused hands and post-war grit. I don't remember closing the door, but I do remember sitting at my kitchen table, staring at that stack of papers like it was a coiled snake. That night, instead of sleeping, I drove the 30 miles to the county courthouse. There's something about the smell of old paper and dust that sharpens your focus. I dug through the HOA's original formation documents, my hands getting black with ink residue. That's when I froze. The HOA had been incorporated exactly 2 months after my father's funeral, and there, in black ink, was his signature on the consent forms, except I knew. With the same certainty I knew my own name. That shaky scrawl wasn't his. Forgery. Not a sloppy clerical error. Not a missing form. Calculated fraud. In that moment, the coffee I'd been running on all day turned to acid in my stomach. Of course, knowing it was fraud and proving it were two different beasts, I needed evidence. I needed a plan. And most importantly, I needed to be 10 times smarter than Janice Bickford had ever been in her petty, power-hungry life. I left the courthouse that night with my headlights cutting through the mountain dark, snowflakes starting to swirl down, and a new resolve hardening in my chest. This wasn't just about some HOA fine. This was about my father's legacy, about making sure his blood, sweat, and years of sacrifice weren't stolen by someone who probably spent her evenings counting how many garden gnomes her neighbors were allowed to have. What I didn't know yet was that Janice wasn't just targeting me. She'd been running her scam on other neighbors too. Veterans, widows, families just trying to keep their heads above water. And that by the time this was over, she wouldn't just regret coming after me. She'd regret ever picking up that sacred clipboard of hers. Let us know where you're watching from today, and if you're new here, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community. The first real shot in this war came at 6:15 on a frosty Thursday morning. I woke to the metallic clanging of something outside, not the gentle chime of my dock chains, but the sharp, rhythmic sound of tools hitting metal, the kind of noise that gets under your skin. I pulled back the curtain, and there she was. Janice Bickford, in all her early morning glory, standing at the edge of my dock like she owned it. She had a rolled-up measuring tape on her belt, a clipboard under one arm, and was barking orders at two men like she was a foreman on a construction site. One of them I recognized instantly, Stanley Briggs, owner of Briggs Hardware downtown. Stanley's the kind of guy who will sell you a hammer with a smile. Then the next week stand behind Janice while she tells you that same hammer violates HOA rules. The other was a wiry man in a faded Carhartt jacket, hunched over a tripod-mounted surveyor's scope. He looked about as comfortable as a cat in a bathtub. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, steam rising into the crisp air. "Morning," I called, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. Janice didn't bother looking up. "We're conducting a comprehensive compliance assessment. HOA regulations grant us inspection access for violation verification." I took a sip. Slow and deliberate. "You mean trespassing?" The surveyor shot me a quick, apologetic glance. Later I'd learn his name was Eli Warner, a freelancer Janice had hired for the day. He'd been promised full payment up front. Spoiler, she stiffed him. They spent 3 solid hours marching around my property like it was a military drill, measuring my dock, my fire pit, even the distance from my back porch to a cluster of aspens my father planted in the 70s. Janice took over 200 photos, including a few where I caught her trying to angle the camera through my windows. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the previous evening installing a full set of security cameras around the cabin. Military logistics teaches you one key rule: documentation beats confrontation every time. Colorado law allows property owners to record anyone on their land without their consent, which meant every step of their little circus was now preserved in high-definition video. When they finally packed up, Eli lagged behind, clearly uncomfortable. He waited until Janice and Stanley were out of earshot, then shuffled up to me, hands jammed in his jacket pockets. "Mr. Mercer, I'm sorry about all this," he said quietly. "She only paid me half my fee, and now she's saying she'll report me for improper surveying if I don't, find violations." I raised an eyebrow. "Even if there aren't any." He nodded. She told me, "Make it look bad. We need ammunition for the lawsuit." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my voice level. "Would you be willing to testify to that if you help me get my money?" "Yeah," he said. I'm tired of working for people like her. It was like someone had handed me the first puzzle piece in a 1,000-piece picture. That afternoon, I started digging. Public records are a goldmine if you know where to look. In under an hour, I learned that Stanley's hardware store owed over $20,000 in back property taxes. And Janice. Her insurance license had been suspended 3 years ago for filing fraudulent damage claims. So here she was, lecturing me about compliance, while her own career had gone down in flames over fraud. The next week, she was back. This time, she didn't bother with Eli. Maybe she'd burned that bridge, but she brought a laminated copy of HOA code sections she claimed I was violating daily. She also hinted she was keeping an eye on me because neighbors were concerned about my temperament. That was the moment I knew she wasn't just playing at code enforcement, she was trying to build a smear campaign. The irony. Every time she showed up, every time she opened her mouth, she was handing me more evidence. My cameras caught it all: the trespassing, the invasive photography, the muttered insults. I even have a clip where she trips over a tree root, drops her clipboard, and swears so loudly it scares a squirrel out of the pines. One evening, while reviewing the footage, I realized something. Janice thought she was tightening the screws on me, but she wasn't playing chess. She wasn't even playing checkers. She was playing tic-tac-toe, and I'd already built the board to trap her every move. What she didn't know, and what I was already planning, was that this war was going to end on my terms, not hers. And it was going to be public. That first real shot in the war came on a bone-cold April morning in Pine Ridge. The mist was still clinging low over the water, drifting between the old pines in front of my cabin, and the only sound I expected to hear at that hour was the gentle lap of the lake against the dock. Instead, I woke to the sharp, metallic clanging of tools and the crunch of boots grinding into my gravel drive. It wasn't the kind of noise you get out here unless someone's either fixing a roof or trying to make trouble, and I had a pretty good guess which one it was. When I pulled back the bedroom curtain, there she was, Janice Bickford, queen of the clipboard, standing on my dock like she'd just annexed it. She had on her unofficial uniform pressed plaid blazer, khaki slacks so sharply creased they could cut paper, and spotless white orthopedic sneakers that probably never touched dirt unless she was on someone else's property. Her sacred clipboard was tucked under one arm, and dangling from her belt was a bright yellow measuring tape, like she thought she was a sheriff in a spaghetti western. Flanking her were two men. One was Stanley Briggs, owner of the hardware store in town, a man whose spine seemed to bend in whatever direction Janice pointed. The other was a wiry guy in a faded Carhartt jacket, crouched over a surveyor's tripod. He looked about as comfortable as a cat in a bathtub, and from the way he kept glancing at Janice, I could tell this was not how he'd hoped to start his day. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee mug steaming in the cool air. "Morning," I called, in a tone that said it wasn't really. Janice didn't even bother to look up. "We're conducting a comprehensive compliance assessment," she announced like she was reading from a law book. "HOA regulations grant us inspection access for violation verification." I took a slow sip. Let the steam drift up between us. "You mean trespassing?" I said. The surveyor flicked his eyes toward me, then back to the scope, but he looked uneasy. Later I'd learn his name was Eli Warner, a freelancer Janice had hired for the day. What she hadn't told him or paid him would come back to haunt her. For the next 3 hours, they clomped around my property like they were on a military drill. Janice barked measurements at Eli, who dutifully recorded them in a notebook, while Stanley followed behind like a kid on a field trip. They measured my dock length, the width of my fire pit, Even the distance between my porch and a cluster of aspens my father planted 50 years ago. Janice took over 200 photos, some of them angled toward my windows when she thought I wasn't looking. What she didn't know, what made me almost enjoy my coffee that morning, was that I'd spent the previous evening installing a full set of security cameras. Military logistics taught me a lot, but the golden rule is this: documentation beats confrontation every time. And in Colorado, you can legally record anyone on your property without their consent. Every one of Janice's compliance checks was being preserved in high-definition video. When they finally packed up, Eli hung back, shuffling his boots in the gravel. He kept glancing at Janice and Stanley, who were now bickering over whether they had enough photos of my tool shed. Once they were out of earshot, he came over. "Mr. Mercer, I'm sorry about all this," he said, voice low. "She only paid me half my fee, and now she's threatening to report me for improper surveying if I don't, find violations." I raised an eyebrow. "Even if there aren't any," he nodded, eyes darting toward where Janice stood. She told me, "Make it look bad. We need ammunition for the lawsuit." My grip on the coffee mug tightened, but my voice stayed calm. "Would you be willing to testify to that if you help me get my money?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm done working for people like her." It was the first real crack in her armor, the first piece of the puzzle that could take her down. That afternoon, I sat down at my desk with my laptop and a mug of black coffee, and I went digging. Public records are a goldmine if you know where to look. In less than an hour, I'd found that Stanley's hardware store owed over $20,000 in back property taxes. And Janice. Turns out her insurance license had been suspended 3 years ago for filing fraudulent damage claims. So, the self-appointed queen of legal compliance was lecturing me while standing knee-deep in her own swamp of bad paperwork and shady business. The next week, she came back no Eli this time, carrying a laminated printout of HOA code sections she claimed I was violating every single day. She also let slip that she'd been keeping an eye on me because, as she put it, neighbors were concerned about your temperament. It didn't take a genius to see where this was going. She wasn't just building a case, she was trying to poison the well, planting seeds that I was unstable, dangerous. In a small town, gossip moves faster than wildfire, and she knew it. What she didn't realize was that every word out of her mouth, every trespass onto my property, every sideways photograph she took was being logged, time-stamped, and backed up to 3 different hard drives. My cameras caught it all, even the moment she tripped over a tree root, dropped her clipboard, and swore loudly enough to send a squirrel scrambling up the nearest pine. Reviewing that footage one night, it hit me. Janice thought she was tightening the screws on me. She thought she was playing a long game, but she wasn't playing chess. She wasn't even playing checkers. She was playing tic-tac-toe. And I was building a trap she didn't even know she'd already stepped into. And the best part, when this finally came to a head, it was going to happen on my terms and in front of an audience she couldn't control. If Janice's early morning compliance inspection felt like a mosquito bite, her next move was a full-blown hornet sting. A week later, just as I was starting to think she might be taking a breather, a process server pulled into my drive at 7:02 a.m., killing whatever peace I'd had with the smell of my first cup of coffee. He stepped out of a dusty Subaru, handed me an envelope thick enough to double as a doorstop, and said, "You've been served." Inside was Janice's legal masterpiece, a lawsuit alleging 62 separate HOA violations dating back 3 years, demanding $15,000 in fines, plus attorney's fees. As a cherry on top, she was asking for an emergency injunction to prevent me from using my own dock until the case was resolved. The dock my father had built with his bare hands, the one where I learned to fish before I could even spell HOA. Reading through the complaint was like reading bad fiction. She accused me of everything from maintaining an unapproved shoreline structure to harboring dangerous wildlife, which I'm pretty sure was her code for the raccoons that wander through at night. She even claimed my porch lights were excessively bright and disrupted the community's natural nocturnal harmony. The most insulting part wasn't the lies. It was the smug knowledge I could feel radiating from every page, the confidence that she'd buried me under enough legal sludge to force me into settling. By lunchtime, the whisper campaign had begun. Pine Ridge is small. And the local diner is where news spreads faster than wildfire in a dry canyon. By the time I walked in for a sandwich, I could feel eyes on me from the counter to the back booth. I caught fragments of conversation unstable, dangerous, used to be in the army. You know, someone had clearly been busy that morning. 2 tables over, old man Crawford, who'd been nothing but friendly until now, avoided my wave, focusing on his coffee as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Outside, Sally from the flower shop crossed the street rather than pass me on the sidewalk. I wasn't just being sued, I was being painted as the neighborhood menace. That's when I called in reinforcements. Her name was Linda Cartwright, a property attorney out of Denver with hair as white as fresh snow and eyes like frosted glass. She'd spent 30 years tearing apart predatory HOA boards and wore her courtroom victories like a tailored suit. I laid out the whole story in her office over bitter black coffee. Every violation notice, every piece of footage, every whispered smear. Linda listened without interrupting, flipping through Janice's lawsuit like it was a cheap tabloid. Then she looked up and said, "Mr. Mercer, this is not just a bad case. This is a bad case built on a foundation of quicksand." She explained that Colorado law has a few quirks most HOAs hope you never learn about. Chief among them, properties with established riparian rights, permanent access to the water, cannot be retroactively forced into compliance with HOA regulations created after those rights were granted. My father's cabin, built decades before the HOA existed, was almost certainly outside their jurisdiction. Then she dropped the real bomb. If your father's signature was forged on those HOA formation documents, we're talking about criminal fraud and elder abuse. That's not just a civil matter, that's a prosecutable offense. It was like she'd handed me a rifle and pointed me toward a wide-open target. A few days later, I decided to take a quiet seat at the monthly HOA board meeting in the community center. I didn't speak. I didn't wave. I just sat in the back with my phone recording legally in my pocket. Janice was mid-rant about dangerous precedent when Stanley Briggs, apparently forgetting how to keep his mouth shut, blurted out, "Well, we all know the HOA formation was pushed through before anyone could object. My cousin at the county office said the paperwork was sketchy from the start." The silence that followed was thick enough to spread on toast. Janice's head snapped toward him so fast I thought she'd get whiplash. "Stanley," she hissed. Not another word. But the damage was done. I had the admission I needed. After the meeting, I stepped outside into the cool mountain air and found myself face to face with 3 neighbors. Martha Jenkins, whose memorial garden had been ripped out by order of the board. Tom Alvarez, a retired Marine who'd been fined for flying the flag on his porch past approved hours. And a young couple, Kyle and Dana, who'd been slapped with $300 in fines because their kids drew hopscotch squares on the community walkway. Each of them had the same look, tired, angry, but also relieved to be telling their story to someone who might actually do something about it. Martha's voice shook as she said, "She made me dig up my husband's roses. Colin, 40 years of marriage," and she called them unauthorized plantings. Tom shook his head. "I've been shot at in 2 different countries, but I've never been as ticked off as I am at that woman." Dana just sighed. "We had to choose between paying her fake fines and buying groceries one month. I don't know how she sleeps at night. By the time I got home that night, I'd realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Janice had built her little empire by picking off the vulnerable people who couldn't afford to fight back, who didn't know the law, or who just wanted to avoid the stress. Well, stress was something I could handle. What I couldn't handle was letting her keep doing it." The next morning, over my first cup of coffee, I went back through my father's old military trunk. That's where I'd already found the original deed, the one that might be my legal silver bullet. But this time I noticed something else, a folded letter, yellowed at the edges, in my father's familiar blocky handwriting. "Colin." It began. "If you're reading this, it means the vultures have started circling. Don't let them take what we built. This land is more than wood and nails. It's ours, and sometimes you've got to fight for it." I sat there for a long time, holding that letter, the smell of old paper and cedar filling the kitchen. The fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was his, too. The next step was clear. I'd keep documenting every move Janice made, every word she spoke, every lie she spread. but I'd also start connecting with every neighbor she'd ever steamrolled. One by one, we'd turn her tactics against her, because if Janice wanted a war of attrition, I was more than ready. And unlike her, I knew how to fight one and wait. If part 3 was when I realized I wasn't alone, part 4 was when I learned just how deep the rabbit hole went and how much ammunition my father had unknowingly left me. It started one rainy Saturday afternoon. The lake was covered in a gray sheet of drizzle, the kind of steady mountain rain that soaks you to the bone in under a minute. I had the wood stove going, coffee percolating, and my father's old military trunk on the floor beside me. I'd already gone through it half a dozen times since inheriting the cabin, but that day I decided to be methodical. I pulled out each item, medals, photographs, a battered compass, even a folded American flag, and laid them on the rug like pieces in a puzzle. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a heavy envelope marked property. Inside was the original 1964 deed to the cabin, along with surveyor's notes drawn in my father's neat block letters. As I read through them, my coffee went cold. The notes clearly showed the property extending 35 feet further west than any of the county maps I'd seen. And that extra strip of land, it happened to contain Janice's pride and joy, the elaborate rose garden she'd bragged about at every HOA meeting, plus the ornate white gazebo where she hosted her community teas. For 3 years, she'd been trespassing on my land while threatening to seize mine. The irony was almost too much to process. But that wasn't the only bombshell. The deed also included permanent riparian rights, granting my property water access in perpetuity. Under Colorado law, those rights can't be stripped by any later HOA regulation, no matter how much they'd like to pretend otherwise. My father had, knowingly or not, built an iron wall around this land decades before Janice ever rolled into town with her clipboard. I set the papers aside and then went back to the trunk. Beneath a stack of faded photos, I found a bundle of letters tied with twine. Most were written to my mother during his deployment, but one was addressed to future owner. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written late in his life. If you're reading this, it said, "You may be dealing with people who think rules make them righteous. They will use paper and procedure like weapons. Do not give them an inch. This land is Mercer land. Protect it. And protect those who can't protect themselves." By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking not with fear, but with the weight of what I'd just inherited. This wasn't just about me anymore. My father had seen the kind of fight I'd be in, decades before it happened, and he'd left me the tools to win. The next step was to put those tools to work. I called Linda Cartwright and read her the deed over the phone. She didn't even let me finish before saying, "Colin, that's a game changer. With those riparian rights and that boundary extension, not only is the HOA's claim over your property invalid, but Janice is in active trespass. And trespass tied to a fraudulent HOA formation, that's a whole new category of liability." Linda also confirmed something else. "We can bring this to the Colorado Attorney General's office. They've been looking for a case that illustrates the worst kind of HOA abuse. You're not just a client anymore. Colin, you're a potential poster child for HOA reform." That night, I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and started drafting what would become Operation Clipboards Down. The idea was simple: build an airtight case that would not only get Janice off my back, but also dismantle her entire operation. Step 1 was gathering allies. I invited the neighbors I'd spoken to: Martha, Tom, Kyle, and Dana to meet at my cabin. Word spread faster than I expected, and by the following Saturday morning, a dozen people were sitting around my father's hand-built dining table, steaming mugs of coffee in their hands, and expressions that ranged from cautious hope to outright fury. I laid out the deed, the surveyor's notes, and a copy of the HOA's original formation documents showing the forged signature. There was a collective intake of breath when I explained that Janice's beloved rose garden was technically on my land. Tom actually laughed. "So the queen's been squatting on your dirt this whole time?" "Yes," I said. "And that's just the start." Eli, the surveyor Janice had stiffed, came forward with his own contribution text messages from her instructing him to find violations no matter what, and threatening to ruin his career if he didn't. Stanley wasn't there, no surprise, but 2 other former board members showed up. bringing records of HOA funds being transferred to a company called Bickford Property Solutions. A quick search showed it was Janice's personal LLC. Martha leaned forward, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "What do we do with all this?" "We build a case," I said. "Not just for me, for everyone she's done this to over the next 2 hours. We mapped out every incident of harassment, every fine, every bogus violation notice. We matched dates, compared stories, and found patterns." Janice's strategy was clear: target those least likely to fight back, bury them in paperwork, and pressure them into selling. Then her LLC or a friend's would buy the property at a discount. By the end of the meeting, we had a list of 15 separate victims and a paper trail that looked like it had been designed by a con artist, which, in a way, it had. I sent copies of everything to Linda, who forwarded them to her contact in the Attorney General's office. Within 2 days, I had a call from an investigator named Paul Hanley. His tone was polite but direct. "Mr. Mercer, I've reviewed the documents Ms. Cartwright sent over. I'd like to meet in person. There are broader implications here than just your property." When I asked what he meant, he said, "If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at racketeering." That word stuck with me all night. Racketeering wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was the kind of charge that could put someone like Janice away for years. While the AG's office began its review, we kept gathering intel. Eli dug through county maps to verify my property boundaries. Tom contacted a veterans legal aid group that offered to help with public awareness. Martha started calling residents who'd moved away under suspicious circumstances, asking if they'd be willing to submit statements. Meanwhile, Janice kept doing what Janice does only now. Every visit, every phone call, every letter was being logged in a shared digital folder. One evening, my camera caught her walking along the edge of the rose garden, talking on her phone. The audio was faint, but you could clearly hear her say, "If I can get him to crack, the rest will fold." I smiled when I played it back. She still thought this was about me. She had no idea the walls were closing in from every direction. By the end of the month, we had a binder 2 inches thick of evidence-forged documents, trespass photos, bank transfers, witness statements, and videos. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a full-blown takedown plan. And the timing couldn't have been better. Because the Attorney General's office had just set a date to meet at my cabin, I knew then she was walking straight into the trap. By the time the Attorney General's office set our meeting date, I was sitting on enough evidence to sink a battleship, or in this case, a power-hungry HOA president with a gambling problem and a fondness for fraudulent paperwork. But having proof wasn't enough. I wanted Janice to feel the walls close in, inch by inch, before the hammer finally dropped. The first stage of my counterattack was all about controlling the narrative. Up until now, she'd been working overtime to paint me as the unstable veteran who was a danger to the community. I needed to flip that script so thoroughly that even the town's biggest gossip mongers would choke on their coffee hearing it. That's where Sophie Tran came in. Sophie was an investigative reporter for Channel 9 in Denver Sharp, relentless, and with a knack for making bad people look even worse on camera. I'd met her years ago when she was covering a corruption scandal involving a county contractor. I gave her a call, explained the situation, and by the next morning she was parked in my driveway with a camera crew. Janice had no idea this was coming. I laid it all out for Sophie: the forged HOA formation documents, the trespassing, the missing funds, the texts from Eli, the rose garden squatting on my land. We didn't just talk, we showed. I walked her past my dock, the unapproved shoreline structure that was older than half the board members. I showed her the security footage of Janice creeping around my septic system at night with a suspicious plastic bag. I even played the recording where she told Eli to make it look bad and threatened to ruin him if he didn't comply. The footage spoke for itself. Sophie's cameraman, a grizzled guy named Mark, actually muttered, "This lady's toast," while reviewing one of the clips. Sophie ran the first segment that Friday evening. She didn't just tell my story, she brought in interviews with other residents Janice had targeted. Martha stood in front of her bare memorial garden and described how she'd been ordered to remove roses she'd planted in honor of her late husband. Tom Alvarez unfurled his full-size flag beside the camera and talked about being fined for unauthorized patriotism. Kyle and Dana spoke about the month they'd had to choose between groceries and bogus HOA fines. The segment ended with Sophie's voiceover. The Attorney General's office confirms they are reviewing multiple complaints against the Pine Ridge HOA, including allegations of fraud, elder abuse, and racketeering. At the center of the investigation, HOA President Janice Bickford. The reaction was immediate. Social media lit up. The diner became unofficial headquarters for what the locals started calling the Free Mercer movement. Murphy's Market put a donation jar on the counter to help cover legal expenses. Within 3 days, over $1,200 had been dropped in by people I didn't even know. And Janice. She was furious. I know because 2 mornings after the broadcast, she showed up in my driveway again. No camera crew this time, just her and Stanley, clutching a fresh stack of urgent violations and snapping pictures of my recycling bins. "You've really done it now, Mercer," she said, her voice tight. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" I smiled, because in that moment, I could see it, the panic behind her eyes. "Not as much as you, Janice." The next week, Sophie aired part 2 of her series, digging into the HOA's financial records. She revealed the payments from HOA accounts to Bickford Property Solutions and showed side-by-side images of Janice's casino trips posted to her own Facebook page, dates that lined up perfectly with cash withdrawals from HOA funds. That's when the Attorney General's office called to move our meeting up by 2 weeks. Public interest, the investigator said. I suspected it was more like public outrage, and I wasn't complaining. While we prepped for the meeting, the coffee club went into overdrive. Eli got notarized statements about Janice's instructions to fabricate violations. Martha and Tom gathered witness lists. Dana dug up emails showing Janice personally rejecting appeals for fines, even when residents had proof they'd done nothing wrong. And then came the cherry on top. Late one Thursday night, my security camera pinged with motion detection. I opened the feed, and there she was. Janice, creeping along the edge of my property, snapping photos with her phone. She paused near the rose garden, muttering into her recorder. Possible encroachment of Mercer's deck, lighting onto common area. I nearly laughed out loud. She didn't realize she was standing on my land. I clipped the footage, labeled it Trespass Exhibit A, and saved it to the evidence folder. The more we collected, the more obvious it became Janice wasn't just desperate. She was sloppy. She'd gotten away with her game for so long, she didn't bother covering her tracks anymore. And with every misstep, she gave us another weapon. By the time the week of the meeting arrived, I had 3 binders of documentation ready for the Attorney General fraud evidence, forged documents, boundary surveys, the original deed, and riparian rights paperwork. Financial misconduct bank transfers to her LLC, mismatched HOA expense reports, and casino trip records, harassment and abuse of authority, security footage, audio recordings, violation notices, and witness statements. Linda looked over the stack and said, "If this doesn't take her down, nothing will." But we still had one card to play, and it was going to be the knockout punch. I printed an oversized copy of the property survey showing Janice's rose garden and gazebo smack in the middle of my land. We decided to hold it back until the meeting, let her walk in thinking she could bluff her way through, then we'd drop it on the table like a gavel. In the meantime, I kept my routine the same. Morning coffee on the dock, chopping firewood, waving to the neighbors who were now waving back. Let Janice think I was oblivious. Let her keep circling. She had no idea that every step she took was just tightening the noose. And soon, she'd find herself right in the middle of the trap we'd been building for weeks, surrounded by her own lies. On camera, with the state's top law enforcement officer watching. The morning of the Attorney General's meeting was one of those perfect Colorado days that almost makes you forget bad things exist. The lake looked like polished glass. The sky was a clean blue dome, and the air smelled faintly of pine sap and wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. I was up early, brewing coffee in my father's dented percolator and laying out the binders of evidence on the dining table. At exactly 2 p.m., a black SUV rolled up my driveway. Out stepped Colorado Attorney General Daniel Ruiz, dressed in a sharp navy suit that somehow didn't look out of place among the pines. Behind him came his aide, a younger guy with a laptop bag, and a plainclothes security officer who scanned the property with the kind of professional detachment that made me think he'd done this 100 times before. We shook hands on the porch. "Beautiful place you've got here, Mr. Mercer," Ruiz said. "Thank you. My father built it," I replied, holding the door open. We'd barely made it inside when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, fast, followed by the squeal of brakes. I didn't have to look to know who it was. A moment later, Janice's white SUV came sliding to a stop in front of the cabin, dust and leaves swirling up behind it. Perfect timing. She climbed out like she was storming a battlefield, clutching her clipboard in one hand and dragging poor Stanley along by the sleeve with the other. She didn't even glance at the SUV with government plates parked right beside her. "Mercer," she bellowed, stomping across the yard. "You're in violation of 17 new HOA codes, and I'm here to conduct an immediate compliance inspection. This," she swept her arm toward the cabin, "this illegal gathering violates occupancy restrictions." The silence that followed was almost comical. Even the loons across the lake seemed to stop calling. Then Ruiz turned toward her, one eyebrow raised. "Ma'am, you just trespassed onto private property, interrupted a state meeting, and are attempting to enforce regulations you have no legal authority to impose." Janice froze mid-stride. "And I'm Daniel Ruiz, Attorney General of the state of Colorado." I swear I saw the color drain from her face. I didn't know. That much is obvious." Ruiz cut in. "Are you Janice Bickford, president of the Pine Ridge HOA?" Her voice faltered. "Yes. But then you should also know we've been investigating you for fraudulent HOA formation, elder abuse, and racketeering." The word racketeering landed like a slap. She actually stumbled backward, her clipboard wobbling in her grip. Stanley tried to take a step back too, but Ruiz's security officer was already moving to cut off their retreat. "This is all lies," Janice blurted. "He's a dangerous veteran who threatened me." "Interesting," Ruiz said evenly, "because we have hours of security footage showing you planting evidence on his property, instructing a surveyor to fabricate violations, and diverting HOA funds into your personal accounts." I stepped forward, holding a rolled-up copy of my father's original property survey. "Oh, and Janice, there's something else you might want to see." I unrolled it on the hood of her SUV, pointing to the clearly marked boundary line. "Your rose garden and gazebo. They're on my land. You've been trespassing for 3 years while trying to steal the rest of it." She stared at the map, eyes darting over the lines and measurements, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to form words but couldn't find any. The measuring tape she always carried slipped from her fingers, hitting the gravel with a metallic clink. "This can't be right," she muttered, but her voice was thin, brittle. Ruiz's aide stepped forward with an official-looking folder. "We've cross-referenced the deed with county records. It's correct, and it means your HOA has been operating outside its jurisdiction since inception." Stanley, sensing the ship was sinking, suddenly found his voice. "I was just following her orders. I didn't know about the missing money or the forged documents." Stanley Janice snapped, but it was too late. Ruiz's security officer nodded toward the driveway. "Ma'am, sir, you're going to have to step away from the property now." "From the porch." I watched them being escorted to her SUV. Janice's voice rose in a final desperate wail about fake news and veteran privilege, but her words had the hollow ring of someone who knew the game was over. As the dust from her tires faded, Ruiz turned to me. "Mr. Mercer, your documentation is thorough. This case will be central to our HOA reform initiative. Expect to testify at the legislature next month." I shook his hand. "Happy to." By the time Channel 9's news van pulled up to film the aftermath, Janice was long gone. Sophie Tran stood in my driveway with a microphone, grinning like Christmas had come early. "You couldn't have scripted that better," she said. The footage aired that night, Janice arriving mid-meeting, Ruiz introducing himself. The moment her face dropped when she saw the survey map, viewers across the state got to watch her retreat under escort, clutching her empty hands where her clipboard used to be. It was the moment the war ended, but the cleanup and the consequences were just beginning. Within a week, the FBI arrested Janice and Stanley on charges of fraud, racketeering, and elder abuse. The HOA was dissolved by court order, its assets seized pending restitution. The local paper ran a front-page photo of Janice in handcuffs, her expression somewhere between fury and disbelief. And me, I finally slept through the night, knowing my father's cabin and my community were safe from her brand of tyranny. The war might have ended the day Janice got marched off my property in front of the Attorney General, but the real victory came in the weeks that followed. That was when the community finally began to heal, and when I realized just how much damage she'd done over the years. The first big shift happened in the courtroom. During her arraignment, the prosecution laid out the evidence: forged HOA formation documents, fraudulent liens, embezzlement, trespassing, harassment, and racketeering. When they played the audio of her instructing Eli to find violations no matter what, and Danny to create evidence if you can't find any, the entire gallery went dead silent. Even the judge arched an eyebrow. The court ordered the Pine Ridge HOA dissolved immediately. All common assets and funds were frozen until the restitution plan could be finalized. Janice's bank accounts and that precious white SUV were seized. Stanley's hardware store was put up for auction to cover back taxes and his part in the damages. When the news hit the local paper, neighbors who had been quiet for years started speaking out. Letters poured into the editor describing how Janice had targeted them, some stories dating back almost to the day she took power. A retired teacher admitted she'd sold her lakefront lot at a loss because she couldn't keep up with Janice's bogus fines. A young family shared that they'd nearly declared bankruptcy after Janice hit them with multiple emergency landscaping assessments. It became clear that what she'd done to me was just one thread in a much larger web. With the HOA gone, the coffee club officially transformed into the Pine Ridge Community Association, a voluntary group with no dues, no fines, and no clipboards. Our meetings went from tense legal strategy sessions to potluck dinners. The first project we tackled together was restoring Martha's memorial garden. 20 neighbors showed up with shovels, plants, and topsoil. By sundown, her late husband's roses were back in the ground, and the air was thick with the smell of fresh earth and grilled burgers from Tom's portable barbecue. Tom himself spearheaded the second project, the Veterans and Families Flag Celebration. It started as a small gesture, a few of us raising flags in our yards to honor those who'd served, but it turned into a full-blown event with food, music, and speeches. The same flagpole Janice had once tried to make him shorten became the centerpiece. As for the patch of land where Janice's rose garden used to be, we turned it into a community compost bin. There was something poetic about the transformation, her symbol of control and vanity, becoming a source of life and nourishment for the whole neighborhood. Personally, the settlement changed everything. The state's Victim Compensation Fund covered my legal fees. The court ordered Janice to pay $92,000 in restitution, divided among all identified victims. She was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Stanley avoided prison but got probation and community service, ironic, since much of that service involved cleaning the same public walkways where he'd once gleefully enforced Janice's chalk violation fines on kids. My relationship with my ex-wife even improved. When she saw the news coverage, she called me. "I didn't realize the scope of what you were dealing with." She admitted, "I thought you were picking fights. I see now you were protecting something important." That call opened the door for my daughter to visit again. The first weekend she came back to the cabin, we went fishing from the dock at sunrise, just like I used to with my dad. She caught a 3-pound bass, and I swear I could almost feel my father's hand on my shoulder in that moment. But the change wasn't just personal, it was statewide. Because of the case, the Attorney General pushed forward with new legislation to protect homeowners from predatory HOAs. I was invited to testify before the state legislature, standing in the same suit I'd worn to Janice's downfall, explaining exactly how a power-hungry board could ruin lives. That testimony made it into the evening news and, to my surprise, onto several national homeowner advocacy websites. I started a YouTube channel, Know Your Property Rights, to share what I'd learned. In less than a year, it grew to over 50,000 subscribers. We've helped expose a dozen more shady HOAs across Colorado, with other states reaching out for advice on reforming their own laws. Linda comes on for regular legal Q&A sessions, and we've built a network of homeowners who now know how to fight back. The cabin has become more than just my home. It's now the Lakefront Veterans Retreat. Using part of the restitution money and donations from supporters, we opened it up for weekend stays for combat veterans who need peace and quiet to decompress. Martha manages the calendar, Tom takes guests out fishing, and Dana organizes community dinners for them. In our first year, we've hosted more than 40 veterans and their families, giving them the same sense of refuge my father gave me. Some evenings, when the sun is setting and the lake is painted in gold and crimson, I sit on the dock with a mug of coffee and think about how close we came to losing it all. I think about how Janice's greed could have destroyed not just my family's legacy, but the fabric of our whole community. And then I look at the compost bin thriving where her roses used to be, at the neighbors laughing around the fire pit, and I know we took something ugly and turned it into something beautiful. Janice will spend the next 5 years behind bars, and even when she gets out, she'll be paying restitution for the rest of her life. That's justice. But the real victory isn't her punishment. It's the fact that Pine Ridge is no longer afraid. We stood up to a bully and won, and now we're stronger for it. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: bullies only win when you let them. Document everything. Stand your ground. And never underestimate what a community can do when it refuses to be pushed around by someone with a clipboard and a power trip. Now I'll ask you, have you ever lived through an HOA nightmare? Share your story in the comments. You never know who you might help by speaking up. And if you want to be part of a growing network of homeowners who fight back, hit that subscribe button and join us. We're just getting started.